Have you ever wondered what is going on in the heads of people who are standing in line to vote, maybe at the point with their pen in their hand, suddenly realizing that despite all of the ads, the debates, the media, they are still unsure how to vote? Well, despite it seeming like everyone is one side or the other in the media, the reality is that there are a lot of people in the middle, unsure what to do, and the final moments of an election can be filled with uncertainty, questions, and a little fear of making the wrong choice. So, what is going on in our heads when we make political decisions, and what are the small things that possibly make a big difference? In the episode today, we're exploring how real-life psychology impacts everything we do, and of course, with the American election just days away that seems to be unavoidable to talk about, we are zooming in on the mysterious psychology of last-minute voters. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Show with me, Samuel Webster Harris, where we are digging into the mindsets and forces that shape our decisions, behaviors, and beliefs. In terms of the format for today's episode, I was invited onto the Beyond Politics podcast hosted by Matt Robinson to explore this topic, and he interviews me. And that's what you're going to be hearing today. So it is a little different from our usual format, but overall it came out as a really good discussion that I think you will enjoy. If you've listened to many of my episodes, you'll probably know that I usually try to avoid politics at all costs because psychology is for everyone and it's hard to talk about politics without offending someone. And I don't believe in placing your own opinions onto others. And I'd rather help people just understand how they think rather than tell them what to think. As such, I will say now that Matt, who hosts the Beyond Politics show, is a Democrat, whereas I will remain impartial throughout as I do have better things to do than alienating half my audience, and hopefully it doesn't annoy you that I'm not on either side. So anyway, if you have ever wondered just how much control we really have over our choices or how much of it is just vibes, well, stay tuned. The episode has some insights that might change how you see not only politics, but your own decision making too.
What do people misunderstand about what's actually happening in voters' minds as they approach election day and they need to actually make two decisions, whether or not to vote and who to vote for? It feels like we have a lot of pop psych about what's going on there and a lot of media theories. But what do you think is actually going on if you could kind of lift the lid?
That's a great question. I think possibly what we don't understand is that we don't understand as much as we think we do, just to start off with that. I think a lot of what's happening is like half the people are obviously already decided, and then all the people that are undecided, it's going to be just confirmation bias principles around what makes a good decision is too hard to actually weigh up. So if you think about how people decide about picking a stock or something, they don't sit and read all of the financial annual statements for Tesla for the past 5 years. They just sort of, okay, my friends have a Tesla, I'll buy a Tesla stock. And we do these like heuristics where we just pick a simpler question that we can answer and we can feel safe making a good decision on because we don't like making wrong decisions. If you're undecided, it's probably because if you don't completely identify with either side, right? In terms of you're not maybe a gun-wielding person that believes women shouldn't be able to have babies when they want to, but you also don't feel the need to talk about your gender identity all the time. And you're just not quite on either side in that sense. And they have all these different policies that don't make sense. And you're not even sure what either would do about them. But maybe you have some Bitcoin. You're like, okay, I'll choose Trump because that's the easiest one that you can make a decision on. And you can actually make a decision about that. And you can't really see the difference otherwise.
That's a very interesting metaphor you're making about simplifying complex decisions. I mean, that's really what the whole idea of heuristics is. I'm a bad chess player, and I tend to like a closed game, the kind of thing where there really aren't that many avenues to calculate because it's all too much for me. I like to simplify things to, I can see one situation and I can analyze that and I can base a strategy off of that. And you're saying that voters do much the same thing. There's so many swirling influences going on in their heads that they may be trying to simplify, winnow it all down to a factor that they can wrap their arms around mentally and work off of that.
Yeah. So either one small identifying thing that they can pick up on and go, okay, that actually does hit me. Or as we've been talking about vibes, as in there's a thing called Gestalt theory that as in if you look at like a brand, you don't necessarily notice the exact font type or the way everything is spaced, but it's the whole thing hits you. And it's the same if you're looking at faces, but also when you use an iPhone, you don't think exactly about how the screws work and everything about it, but like you just have an iPhone vibe that is good. And if there isn't one single thing that sticks out to you, then all of the little things do add up. So it does make sense to be working on all fronts of the political spectrum, to be fighting on those things, but people won't necessarily know why any one of those little things is making any difference at all.
What I think it would be terrifying about that, I used to manage campaigns, is that we think in the political world that we can exert much more influence over voters' decisions than you're suggesting we really can. I mean, it sounds like in your telling of it that perhaps people aren't even fully conscious of what's driving their decisions. Is that the case? Do a lot of these kinds of decisions in politics boil down to deep influences that are really hard to put our fingers on from a kind of management standpoint?
Yeah. If you look into the concept of free will, there's only limited spaces where you actually have free will. So we don't always choose what we like and desire. They're already built into us in the most place. And so if you happen to like Donald Trump's style of talking, that's kind of already built into you. That's not something you chose. Or if things annoy you about one side, that's already going to happen. It's more, I don't know how to say, so you have free will. Basically, things are a bit more deterministic than we'd like to think they are. Although obviously you still have a choice, and whatever you do want and desire and that you still get to make those choices. It's just that you didn't actually choose what those choices were going to be, if that makes sense.
It does. And what I think is extra terrifying for Democrats like me, who feel like maybe the country is on the verge of collapse if Donald Trump gets reelected, and the primary interest in listening to you with your UK accent is maybe you can help us get visas and escape. It implies the idea that it's not just we're not in charge of our own decision making as much as we think we are. It's also that there's a certain randomness that we can't control and that could greatly impinge on our thought process as we come down to the wire in what is a very consequential decision. So talk to me a little bit about availability bias, recency bias. We have some strong evidence from the political side of things that, for example, in 2016, the Comey letter coming right before, about this amount of time before Election Day, swung the election to Donald Trump. And now we're coming off of this pretty bonkers event over this past weekend where at this Trump rally, there was, it kind of melted down into a lot of racist garbage, and people are speculating, will this be the event? Is this the kind of thing that could swing the election, perhaps the other way? How much are random events and these kinds of heuristics in our brains, how much influence do they wield?
Yeah, they are very powerful. So the recency bias, basically, if you think of memory, it's a bit like doors. Each thing triggers you to go through like one door to get to the next room where you might then think about something else. If I talk about maybe the smell of porridge for me, makes me think of my nan, which then might make me think of bath time and playing with her or something. But there's a series of things to get further and further, which if you're trying to weigh up all things that you're making a decision on for politics, there's loads of them. And so you're just going to go through the first door, which is, okay, it was chaos with whatever just happened and this was really bad or really good, so you're going to like them. So I think, for example, if Donald Trump had the assassination attempt like today, almost certain he would probably win the election, for example. But I think, unfortunately for the Democrats, this is probably a worse thing, as in Donald Trump normally gets away with bad things in terms of just his whole personality and style. It doesn't really affect him so much compared to all other people who would get cancelled. Whereas if something bad happened for Kamala, that it could be game over for her because of that. So
why is that?
So I think two reasons with Donald Trump, because the way he speaks, so much of it is kind of fantastical and lies, and he just has this aura of things. It's not out of character for what you expect of him. As in, you don't have a surprise event when it turns out there's some shady stuff with him because you already expect that to be there. Whereas if Kamala turns out had been doing some kind of sleazy stuff with young boys, you'd be like, what's wrong with Kamala? This isn't what I know about her, kind of thing. On the one hand. And then the other hand is, if you do like Trump, he just denies everything, just constantly fake news, election was stolen, everything's just out to get me. And it just adds confirmation to the fact that you think everyone's out to get him. So it's not actually a problem. So yes, that makes it harder, whereas that obviously wouldn't be the case for Kamala, as I've said.
It's not sort of a new thing for me from my background in working in politics. I even put this into the introduction to my mini series, The War to Win Minds, which was my last dive into psychology and the intersection with politics. And I told a story about a political cartoon that I'd seen 24 years ago. This was during the 2000 election when George W. Bush was on the ballot. It's a very simple cartoon. It just shows a man, and in each panel, there are 4 panels. The first one, he says, I like George W. Bush because his father was president. The second panel, it says, I liked George Bush Sr. because he was Ronald Reagan's vice president. The third one, it says, I liked Ronald Reagan because he was in movies. And the fourth panel, the man just says, I like movies. And your story about maybe you have this association with bath time and your nan, and it does feel to me like that is the quintessence of this kind of association that drives so much of our thinking and the way we approach things as campaign people, as media people. We look at issue polling. And I'm right now in the middle of writing an article in which I'm going to say, look, pollsters are showing that the voters were still out to make a decision. Here are the issues that are most important to them. But I have to question, are those really the issues that are important to them? Or is there something under the surface that is really driving this? And I don't know if I find that disturbing or sort of insightful and sort of helpful, because it gives us a window into maybe we sweat so much let me give you my position on how to fight inflation, whereas really what we need to do is think about, don't I remind you of bath time with your nan?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think both candidates can play into that a bit, but I think that works better for Trump. But it definitely is a issue for people who still get to decide, as in, if you do have issues with your welfare state, if there's one that clearly makes a statement that like their welfare checks are going to get bigger, like they'll go with them. But otherwise, it's definitely going to be, as I was saying, like the more grander, harder to even identify why it gives you this feeling. And yeah, if you like a young lady or something, it's obviously going to be more Kamala Harris, and you've got Taylor Swift or Beyonce supporting her, for example. But then Donald Trump, I think the way that he speaks, which is just really interesting. And so there's 2 areas here which I think he really wins on, is that for people who have a higher intelligence level, it's actually really annoying the way he repeats himself and kind of dumbs things down. But then most people aren't reading Nietzsche. They're more likely to be reading like 50 Shades of Grey. And he does come at you with a very simplistic level. He doesn't talk about all these different levels of policies. He just talks about the big picture and makes it obvious that he's going to make it wonderful and fantastic. And he comes across also a bit like a dreamer, as in even if he was to talk about his speaking style, he'd be like, I have the best speaking style ever of any speaking style. All of the people in the world, they come to tell me how good my speaking style is. I fill all of these stadiums because of my speaking style. It's just the best that ever was. And he's like such a dreamer, which kind of epitomizes the American dream a little bit, just in the way he's so fantastic and just makes it so simple for you. So he's got 2 really big wins there, mostly for people, which, yeah, I would say try and keep it simpler if I was advising someone on how to combat that.
Because you think that fundamentally there's something that sort of attacks the deeper brain in the way Trump presents.
Yeah, definitely. It can speak to bigger things, and it can be easier to identify yourself in, I think. As obviously when you actually look at some of the specifics of it, it's like very easy to not identify yourself with it. But when he talks about more just random policies of why things should be good or that they used to be bad, and he can make them good again, I find it easier to understand.
It's something that's kind of mind melting for Democrats. If you ever see Trump at one of his rallies dance, for example, which he did for 40 consecutive minutes on stage last week, or mime driving a truck. He mimes driving a truck the way you would if you were in like a 6th grade musical, like big exaggerated motions on a pretend wheel, or mining coal, which he does by pretending to dig a shovel in and sort of throw it over his shoulder, Derek Zoolander style. It seems like this is someone that working people could not possibly identify with. But somehow
know what you mean.
His manner of speaking makes it feel like he's not an ultra wealthy plutocrat who has nothing in common with me. He shares my frustration. There's something that breaks through about that.
Yes, it makes no sense logically written down, but then reality, it's just much easier to understand. And I don't know what else to give you other than it's a simple language that is constantly validating itself.
Let's talk about another ultra wealthy weirdo, Elon Musk. You suggested to me before we were recording that you think that Elon Musk's stunts will have an impact, despite the fact that he's highly alienating, like is as strange as you could possibly get. Mm-hmm. And yet you think what he's doing could work. What do you mean?
So we've spoken about just small things that make a difference in a big way. So the idea that you can win money from him by joining into things, you just feel a little bit signed up to perhaps voting in that way if you're unsure. And then in general, okay, if you're in Democrats, he's regarded as a complete noob these days, but he's the world's richest man and is known for being very intelligent, and he does magic with what SpaceX have just done and has just built all these game-changing technologies. And so if he does say things like, this is a really sensible decision that's going to be the best thing for the rest of your life, it does still impact some people who can have some respect for him and don't know why they would vote otherwise. And there's a thing where you basically look to people that you can affiliate with or just have a reason to have more information than you. And you're like, okay, if this person understands how to do all this crazy stuff and can tell me what's a good vote, I can understand why they would think that this then means it's a good vote.
If you were whispering in the ear of each campaign manager, I'd like to hear what you would say to each of them about the upcoming week and what they should be doing, thinking about these voters who, let's just say my friends at Change Research who have done this work to suggest that about 13% of the electorate might still be movable. So that's who you need to talk to. What would you say to each of them about what they should do and how to get through to them from your expertise standpoint? And I mean, you can pick either one to do first. I mean, you could do Harris or you could do Trump.
Nice question. I think I have similar advice for both parties. I'd start by giving the example that most people who play tennis need to work on just not missing the basic shots rather than hitting fancy shots, and they lose the game by the shots they miss rather than the shots they ace. And right now, they both have 50% of the vote pretty much, and the chances of trying something difficult and edgy that isn't part of their routine and it blowing up in their face could lose them the vote, and that would be kind of stupid. So trying to do any crazy strategy could actually be a bigger risk than doing what they're already doing. Of course, if either side has some incredible dirt on the other side that they are saving, great, they should try and use that now, I guess, but they don't need me to tell them that. However, I think the most obvious thing that they are both missing slightly through being in their own bubble surrounded by people who are already voting for them is appealing to the middle. Both political sides are further apart than they've been in a long time, and Kamala has a brand for being overly diverse, innovation controlling, and woke, whilst Trump has the brand of being incredibly anti-immigration to the point of being racist, free market capitalism, and all number of more extreme right-wing values. But the thing is, they already have the votes of their own party members, and they don't need to appeal to their own side anymore. They need to appeal to the confused people in the middle who feel they don't want an extreme political ideology. They just want a normal person with their head screwed on. So I think there's an opportunity to tone down their messages that got them to where they are and focus on what gets them the most mass appeal from just the average everyday American. If I was to go more specific here, I think the biggest area of undecided voters is young men who are leaning slightly Republican, but can be more open-minded, whereas young women are very much more on the Democrat side. So for Donald, appealing for young men, appearing on podcasts, which I think he is doing, and trying to get in their ears as a rational guy who listens, and toning down his simplistic talk, toning down his extreme talk, and about rounding up millions of pet-eating migrants, etc. And then for Kamala, She really needs to show that she isn't just fighting for young women, who is the demographic she has been targeting, but that she does also care about young men too. I think she has allowed them to feel marginalized and alone in a world where you get cancelled for being a guy that just wants to have a beer and not consider your gender. I think in both cases, they really haven't made it clear enough how they're going to improve the prospects of young men who are increasingly unemployed, single, and just left behind by their country. And that is a huge area I think they can both speak to. They can talk about men's mental health. Instead of the common rhetoric that we have a problem with masculinity, I think we have a problem with lack of masculinity and lack of prospects to follow pursuits that make you feel valued. On that bombshell, we are off for a quick advert break to keep the show alive before coming back to the psychology of voters and political strategies. You're welcome to skip the ads, but please do stay tuned.
Let me ask you, as a psychologist and a podcaster, you have expertise in both. I've been really interested in the Trump campaign strategy of going after young men through podcasts. I have a little bit of a theory here. Oh boy, I'm about to get shut down by someone who actually knows what they're talking about. I have a theory about the way people absorb podcasts. I think it's unlike video. I think that, no, it's true that video nowadays, you tend to watch on your phone. You might even have earphones in for it. But because it's a visual medium, it's something that is on display for everyone. And it feels more public. Whereas the old radio experience, a significant proportion of your audience was listening to radio that would be on in a public place or on in your car where other people could hear it on a speaker. Most podcasts are listened to individually. It's not a communal event. It's listened to over a set of earphones and it's going right into your ear. I think it's a much more intimate experience. It's literally a voice in your head. And I wonder if there's something kind of brilliant about a strategy of going after undecided voters through podcasts. And if podcasts are, I mean, we're both podcasters, so this is it's a little self-interested, but I wonder if there's more of an effect when you're trying to tap into voters, all of these deep-seated feelings, these drivers in our brains that aren't logical, that are much more emotional. I wonder if podcasts are the way to get there.
Yeah, I think that is a really strong point. It is fascinating that it is so much more private. It's really intimate. And something I found from interviewing lots of my own listeners was they really come for the vibes in a way that I didn't understand. The number one thing people have told me about why they listen to my show is how soothing it is. And I'm like, what? I'm making all these lists of information points and I'm educating you and I'm trying to make it funny or like interesting, but I wasn't expecting that I was going to be soothing people. And it just made me realize that there's a lot more to it. And if you can just have a conversation where Trump gets along with the person, even if they ask them difficult questions, but Trump still manages to get it onto an interesting, if it just sounds like they're having an intelligent conversation for an hour, he'll come off really well. And I have listened to a few of his ones and he has come off quite well. And he does change how he's talking. So if he's talking to someone really techie, he will do less of his dumbed down talking style and come across more intelligent, which I've noticed, which is quite fascinating. And I think it does have an effect, yes, basically.
First of all, I would not undersell the slightly anodyne, soothing effect of your show. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And you can't avoid it because I'll give you some feedback. Here's an insight you may not possess. To an American audience, a British accent is inherently soothing. It sounds like a parody of John Cleese reading the news on the BBC. It feels like it adds an element of refinement. There's a listener expectation of, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. I mean, just check out that accent, right? Like he must have deeper knowledge than the rest of us. So it's totally agree with your point about vibes. And one of the things I've been thinking about, now we're veering off into podcasts, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot about my own show, every week I do this roundtable and it's me and a former Democratic congressman and a current Republican political consultant. And the most important thing about the show to me is the vibe. and the fact that the three of us really get along and really each other. And that has to come through. And from time to time, we get into arguments, and that's okay. But the argument has to be like the kind of argument you're having with your friends. It's my thesis that listening to a podcast feels like you come to a party and there's a group of people in the corner and they're having a conversation, and you step in and you join the circle. And if there's discord, it's really uncomfortable. It's really awkward. And I think people don't like it. And if we ever have a moment where our tensions get high, I'm like, let's not do this. It happens from time to time, even with friends. My point is, I have no evidence. This is witless empiricism, and I'm saying this to a psychology expert. I can't believe it. But I really do think that there is something smart about the podcast strategy and about trying to literally get into people's heads. And something about that vibe is incredibly high leverage psychologically. I cannot prove this, and we'll see after the election, but it strikes me as a very smart strategy.
Definitely. It's the whole people don't remember what you say, but they remember how you make them feel. And back to if it's just the general whole vibe about you, it's like, if you listened and sounded kind of reasonable because you spoke to someone that I like, it's, as you said, like you liked GIF of you voted for Bush because of his father, because of Reagan, because of movies kind of thing. It's just talking nicely with Joe Rogan for an hour and you like Joe Rogan, you're probably going to be like, okay, I guess I like Trump, for example. But as in Kamala's also doing it. I haven't listened to any of Kamala's ones, actually. I was listening to some of Biden ones beforehand, but I haven't noticed her on any.
She's gotten better. I mean, I think she has become a lighter, kind of more enjoyable vibe. This feels like a terrible way to evaluate our leaders. But here we are. This is
definitely
the thing.
I mean, she nailed the presidential debate, for example. It's a pity that they didn't have a second round closer to the election.
I'll ask you about that. That sets up an interesting question, because we all play armchair psychologist at home when we evaluate political events. And there was a lot made of Kamala's kind of boss alpha move, come invade Trump's space and shake his hand at the beginning and assert some dominance and confidence and blah, blah, blah. And I even talked about it on the show, and I said, this strikes me as a good move. But is it like, my point is that we do a lot of this, but I think a lot of it also has kind of a half-baked Dr. Phil quality to it. What drives you craziest about how the media talks about, it could be voter psychology or just psychology in general, versus the reality? Like, are there things that stick in your craw? You're like, that's just not right at all.
Something I generally say in psychology and on my show a lot, which is, it's called the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast. And to understand growth mindset, you kind of need to understand all psychology, because growth mindset is just, it's like the tip of the iceberg of, isn't just the theory about growth mindset that you can develop your skills by working hard, etc. There's so much behind that. And you're not just going to suddenly have a growth mindset just because you've heard that theory. And yeah, you probably need to understand the psychology of narcissism, the psychology of attachment theory, like the psychology of consciousness, to actually be able to fully grasp the full concept of growth mindset. And so there's so much bubbling under the surface that is completely neglected when you just say any one thing. There's so much more to it. Following this, a big issue with talking about psychology is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the less you know, the more confident you are. So a single explanation from a psychologist as a news bite somewhere will lead people to assuming that that is the word, they know everything, confirmed, done deal, whereas an individual who has a lot more knowledge will be aware of all the things they still don't know. So it can sometimes feel like public opinion can be very grabby for easy answers because complexity of it all isn't as sexy or simple to digest. And another thing I do really hate is the binary nature of using psychology to diagnose someone or something as bad. And often people are seeking confirmation of what they already believe rather than listening to what a good psychologist would say if, let's say, somebody has dark triad traits and they have narcissism or histrionic disorder or borderline or whatever. The psychologist would say they deserve to be supported and helped rather than vilified. And you could look at the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case as an example where people were following all these psychologists online to just confirm their hate rather than to dispel it. The thing is, if you spend enough time in psychology or learning about it, you see that all people are just a little bit broken and terrible at communication, and no one was born to deliberately hurt others, and they just panic a lot and they see danger in all the wrong places, which leads them to stupid decisions. But there is a way to resolve things and to understand the behaviors of others and yourself, which possibly is why people might find my show soothing, come to think of it, as I do try to hold space for ownership of your faults without blame. And I try to help people come away with a realization that the world isn't as scary a place as it seems when you're more curious behind why people do stupid things. But yes, in summary, answer to the question, it does annoy me when people want to use psychology to confirm the other side are a bunch of evil idiots, because quite luckily, it is more complex than that, basically.
You're saying that there's a lot more to it, that the things we learn from psychology can be true, but there's frequently a yes and element to it.
Exactly. And if it's an easy explanation, almost certain that it's probably not as easy as it seems. And there is a theory that if a story is really simple, it's more likely to be true as well, just to confuse things. Yeah. If I gave an explanation to any of your questions with just one point in psychology and said, this is the answer, it might have been easier to say, and I could have wrapped it up in a much better analogy and it would have sounded good. But then the reality is that I still only spoke about 20% of what I could have really spoken about in each of those answers. And you would have learned a lot more if I'd given you all of it. Yes.
You extemporaneously come up with a new philosophical principle that's the opposite of Occam's razor. It's Harris's razor, which is the argument that is simplest is less likely to be true. It's great. You've just invented it. We're going to trademark it, copyright it, and it's all yours. Speaking of psychoanalyzing the news, let's get out of here on this. You talked about your podcast, Growth Mindset, and I think it's a great title because I think it resonates. More people want to have a growth mindset. People are unhappy and would like to grow out of it. It's an observation you and I were talking about before we started recording. And it's, I use as a jumping off point, a data point from polling in the US that over the last 4 or 5 decades, about 2/3 of us are unhappy with the direction that things are going. And I think that attaches not just to the direction in general, but frequently to our own lives, which is what your show is focused on. But when you look at it collectively, you see it not just in the US, but in democracies around the world. There's been a backlash, especially in elections this year, a lot of anger and a lot of anti-incumbent sentiment. To what do you attribute that? Why do you think that we're seeing this kind of collective psychology of dissatisfaction with the direction things are going and anger at the people in charge?
One thing I think is quite interesting is in the same way like education is getting behind these days, as in it was invented 2 centuries ago, it's taught by people from last century to people of this century. It's just not cutting it in terms of what people actually need for the next decade of their life. And politics is still kind of lagging. And if you look at the history over the last sort of 5,000 years of how politics has changed, like there has been waves of change in political systems as technology has changed. And things are moving really fast now, and it hasn't really kept up so much. And I think we're so able to get down these content wormholes and ideological wormholes that we are becoming more fragmented within our countries and have different areas that we want to go in and multiple niches. Like even on YouTube, 15 years ago, there weren't so many niches on YouTube, but now there are so many of them. And there's so many more niches of things that are very important to you that just can't be spoken to on the political stage under one country, that almost everyone's feeling like there's something important to them being missed out. So you're going to annoying everyone if you are in power, which has always been true, but I think it's becoming even more truer because of that. And then there's the general concept of, like I spoke about, confirmation bias at the start, and we are kind of wired to find things that easy answers for stuff that we can believe. And there's now AI trained on your brain to just hit you with more and more of those things that is increasingly polarizing people and hitting you with the idea that things are worse than they were, because it just makes more news headlines and just grabs your attention because you are designed to be more scared of things that are potentially bad as opposed to interested in things that are like kind of good but not that important right now. So there's just so much more bad news coming at you or the idea that something is wrong. Whereas like actually the economy right now, number of jobs, and just like the standard of living is the best it's ever been. And even if you look 10 years ago, it was worse. 20 years ago, much worse. Like 50 years ago, it would be awful if you wanted to try in the 50 years ago. Like 100 ago, like 30, 40% of babies didn't live past the age of 10. And that was only 100 years ago. And people kind of forget that up until 100 years ago, humanity lived with almost half of their children dying. And you're like, that would be so bad and traumatic to think of everyone you know having half of their children die right now. But we kind of forget that was just like common for humans. So yes, things are much better than we think they are. The answer to that.
I think that's a great note to end on. For people who want to check out your show, you can help make yourself feel better listening to Growth Mindset. Sam, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Okay, thank you for listening to the show, and I hope you found it interesting and a little bit soothing. It certainly is an important election, but it probably isn't the most important election that has ever happened in history, and it is certainly worth remembering that human psychology has this weird tendency to assume everything is apocalyptically important right now, this moment, when it usually isn't, and whatever does happen, this too shall pass. So look after yourselves, and if you ever have had the urge to chat to me, I do have my free calls available on Wednesday afternoons to hear what is occurring in your world and mind. And of course, if you feel like joining the premium subscription, our Discord has a place for co-working sessions and accountability chats, and it would be great to have you on board. I shall leave you with this Winston Churchill quote. He says that politics is the ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and even next year, and to then have the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen. And on that, have a worry-free weekend. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.